environment and development go together. I welcome Mr. Ashish Kothari to.
The first part of this presentation will be the bad news. So that's the depressing part, which is really about the impacts that modern form of development and especially globalized development has had in India. And the second part is the good news, which is where people are trying to respond to that in both resistance and also positive, constructive ways, trying to develop new forms of well-being which don't cause the problems that I talked about in the first part. So India's growth story has been very impressive, especially in the last 25 years. And some of the indicators are it is now one of the world's 10 biggest economies. It has had very rapid growth for certain parts of these last 2 decades. We're supposed to be proud that 5 of the 10 richest people in the world are Indians or former Indians, and number of mobile phones, etc. I mean, you can count different indicators for what people say is the rapid progress that India is making. But if you look at the impacts of this advertisement captures it very nicely. It's an Indian multinational corporation which essentially, I won't read out the text here, but essentially it says that nature is a barrier towards development. And in order to develop, like laying a pipeline, you have to rip through jungles in Indonesia, move the earth in India, etc., etc. So the mindset of development is that we want material, physical progress, financial, monetary progress, and anything that stands in the way, whether it is nature or it is communities and culture, that has to be swept aside. So it's a form of violence. The development today is a form of violence. Some indications of that, of course, are the kind of loss of the ecological loss that we've faced in the last few decades. These are some statistics. I'm not going to bore you with statistics, but it's interesting to look at the extent of destruction that has taken place of natural ecosystems, human habitat, agricultural biodiversity, and so on and so forth. A lot of this may or may not be relevant to Ladakh in particular, but I think many things are. I mean, for instance, we're learning that domesticated by a lot of the local crops in Ladakh are also losing out because of cheap rice coming in or wheat coming in. So this is one indication of the kind of impacts. Agriculture, in fact, has been one of the most seriously affected sectors in India due to this process. And again, we're not going into too much detail, but if you look at it, agriculture, especially small-scale agriculture or mountain agriculture or shifting agriculture or dryland agriculture, are all in very serious crisis. And I guess the most serious, the most dramatic indication of that is the number of suicides that are being committed by farmers, including in the areas where the government has implemented the Green Revolution. Okay, so clearly there's something very seriously wrong with this model of agriculture, which attempts to keep increasing food grains production, which of course is necessary, but it does it in a way that both the land and the biodiversity and small-scale farming and other kinds of farming are actually losing out. It's only the big farmers who may be benefiting, and of course people like us in cities who have the grains easily and cheaply to be able to consume. Now, it's often said that countries like India need to go through this process. We need to not worry about the environment and culture and things like that, because we have to develop. We have to develop. Why? Because there are lots of people who are poor, they don't have enough to eat, etc. And development is necessary to move people out of poverty, create jobs, give housing, sanitation, etc. So we've done a detailed study in a book that we published, my co-author and I, 3 years back. Unfortunately, my co-author is stuck in Srinagar, or somewhere between Srinagar and here. I'm not sure. He was supposed to be here yesterday. There is a copy of the book in case anybody wants to see it here. And so what we looked at is to see, is that real, that people are actually substantially moving out of poverty and getting housing, etc. And then at some point we'll worry about the environment. Or is there something problematic in this theory? So let's take a look at some of the facts on this. Jobs. So it is said that this form of development will actually create lots more jobs. The truth of the matter is, just 2 months back, the government of India itself admitted that there is 20% unemployment in India, India's youth. Average unemployment is about 12, 13, 14%, but the youth is 20%, and it's increasing. Why? Because most of the money is actually going into the organized sector, like IT industry, automobiles, this kind of government, etc., which actually employs a very small section of India's population, and even in that, there is no substantial growth in jobs. The big reason for that, of course, is that all sectors are getting mechanized. Okay, so people are actually, that many people that are getting jobs, virtually the same amount are actually losing jobs. A good example of that is Tata company, steel production in Jamshedpur. They now produce about 5 times more steel than they did 25 years back, with 1/3 the workforce. Okay, so 2/3 have actually been laid off, which of course means that Tatas are earning much more profits, but people are not getting employment in that. If you look at poverty line, if you take poverty not just in terms of the money income, the $1.25 rate kind of thing, World Bank kind of definition, but you look at it in terms of deprivation from basic needs: clean water, adequate nutritious food, clean air, learning facilities, health facilities, sanitation, housing, etc., then according to us, at least 70% of India is still poor. And in fact, the latest government figures show that 66% of India's rural population is in the deprived category. So that's official statistics that even the government is admitting now. And of course, we have other indicators like health, where we should be proud that we have the world's largest number of malnourished or undernourished women and children. Interestingly enough, Mr. Modi, who is shown there with his 12 lakh rupee jacket, in his Gujarat, during his 3 terms as Chief Minister, the percentage of children who were stunted, which means that there was not enough nourishment during, after they were born, went down from 42% of Gujarat's children to 40% of Gujarat's children. Virtually no difference, despite very rapid rate of economic growth in Gujarat. So that whole model that he has now brought into the center is seriously faulty. So, and then of course there is also cultural and social erosion. Now I have taken the liberty of picking up a few things from the Ladakh vision document, which I think has some very good things in it, possibly because of the contributions of people like Wangchukley and Sonam Dawale and others. So here is what they talk about Ladakh, but it's something that's true for all of India. It seems that somewhere along the way, the importance of social and cultural values has been forgotten. Ladakh is not an exception to this development. Though connected to the outside world only 40 years back, it has already shed much of its traditional wisdom and cultural heritage. A similar story in India. Now, one is not therefore saying that all of tradition was good. There were many problematic parts of Indian tradition. But there was a lot that was good, and we're very rapidly losing it. We're changing, cultures are changing and becoming very confused all across the country. And my last slide, I'm going to come back to this issue of values. So let's just keep this in mind. Next. Okay, but then where is all the money that is generated by this growth going? And here's a very interesting recent statistic, I think from last year, that 1% of India, which includes at least some of the Indians sitting in this room, own 50% of its wealth, the private wealth, not government properties, but private wealth. If you take the top 10%, the richest 10%, that's about 70% of India's wealth. And this has increased. This inequality has actually increased over the last 2 or 3 decades. It's not decreasing. This is not just an Indian phenomenon, it's a global phenomenon. Anybody here from the US? Many from the US, right? Yeah, I think your statistics are worse. Yeah, but we're coming in your direction, so that soon you can welcome us in the same. Okay. Next. Right. One of the phenomenon that actually underlies this is the overconsumption by the rich. Now, India often hides itself in terms of, you take for instance the climate change debate. India says our per capita carbon emissions are very low compared to say the US and so on, China and so on, which is true. But what that is doing is actually it's hiding behind the poor. Because the poor poor are emitting so little carbon that they hide the incredible amounts of carbon emissions by our rich people. It's the same as between India and the US, the same within India between the poor and the rich. And you can see that. If you look at consumption patterns, I come from Pune, and now in the last 10 years or so, I think we've got a shopping mall in virtually every third or fourth street. And the same thing is happening in all cities. And that consumption level is one part of a very, very deep rooted part of the problem. So if we put all of this together, to me and to a lot of other people, it seems very clear that we need a very drastic shift. We can't simply be talking about tinkering within the system. We need to actually fundamentally change the way we're doing things, the way we're relating to the earth, the way we're relating to each other, the way we think of progress, prosperity and so on. And again, taking from the Ladakh Vision document, talking about Ladakh, but it could be for anywhere in India. Rapid decline in this region's resources, natural, social, cultural, we've witnessed in the recent past. The need of the hour is to bring immediate stop to this shocking deterioration by developing an appropriate set of preventive measures. And the Chief Executive Councillor, in fact, of the Hill Council has also said that let's make sure that progress in Ladakh means overall well-being of humans and nature, and not just a blind rush for material development. Nice. I mean, I think this kind of somewhat captures the need for this shift. So do we have the possibilities of such a shift? One of the things that we are told when we do this kind of critique of the current model of development is, yeah, it's not so good, but we don't have any other alternative. The TINA factor, there is no alternative. It's called the TINA factor. So what we've done in this book, and then subsequently through these gatherings that we're doing across the country, is to actually show that yes, there are alternatives. There's not one, but there's many alternatives. If we just open up our eyes to see that. So one part of the alternative, of course, is resisting the current form of development. And that's most important for those who are victims of this development. People who are displaced, people whose forests are taken away, people whose water is taken away, people whose land is taken away for mining or big dams or whatever current form of development is. This is a very classic resistance that has happened in Odisha, in the state of Odisha, against a British mining corporation, which was successful. So it's become one of those iconic things. Anybody here has seen the film Avatar? Avatar. Many of you have. Okay, so this is called the Indian Avatar. Actually, the Avatar should have been called the American Dongriya Kon. That's the tribe. Anyway, so there's a lot of this kind of resistance that's taking place, which is really important because what it does is that, first of all, it provides us a counter narrative. It provides us a sort of a mirror saying that, okay, even people like us who benefit from this development, when we see this, we say maybe something is wrong somewhere. And the second thing is it gives us time. Because the more we're able to stop these kinds of destructive projects, the more time we have to devise constructive alternatives. And that's the second part of the alternative. Just click rapidly a few times. So we actually find that across India, on every sector that you can think of, people are coming up with some amazing alternatives. And that includes what's happening in Ladakh on many fronts. Just keep clicking. Dolma, just stay. And I'm going to give a few examples of some of these different sectors. Just go on. Keep going. Yeah, this was just true. Yeah. So let's start with what is probably the most important one, which is food. And I already mentioned to you the problems with the Green Revolution model. So I'm going to give you an example of an initiative which is a very different one. That's just one example, but there are many, many more like that, which we don't have the time to get. Next, this is an organization that has been set up in Andhra Pradesh, in the state of Andhra Pradesh, which is run mostly by small-scale Dalit farming women. Now, anybody here who knows the Indian social system will realize that it means that these are triple disprivileged people. Okay, small farmers are disprivileged, like I said with agriculture. As women, they have they're oppressed in many different ways compared to men. And as Dalits, that's the so-called outcasts, they are the lowest in the social hierarchy. So in the last about 30 years, this organization with a few thousand of these women has actually completely revolutionized, transformed their agricultural situation from being one of scarcity, lack of adequate water, lack of education facilities, lack of health facilities, etc., into right now, if you go there, you will know what the true meaning of prosperity should be. Okay, how did they do it? It's a long story. I don't have the time to go into it in detail. But their basis of starting was to revive their organic, traditional, diverse forms of agriculture, bringing back millets into their lives, bringing back local varieties of rice and things like that. And in fact, millets probably something that's very relevant for Ladakh also. We're losing millets very rapidly to rice and wheat. These people brought about 60 varieties of millets back into the agriculture. They stopped all chemical use. They set up these grain banks in every village so that if you're a poor farmer, you could access grains to sow without having to pay for them, and many other things. The last point here is what I find actually most interesting. As you know, India has a ration shop system, right? A public distribution system in which you're supposed to get cheap food grains. Ladakh has a ration shop system. Yeah, so the PDS system, as it's called. The PDS system, at least in the rest of India, I don't know here, is enormously corrupt. It is bad food grains, all kinds of problems are. So they set up their own parallel PDS system in about 60-70 villages, in which the locally grown, healthy, nutritious, organic, diverse food is put there. And because there's no transportation cost, it's reasonably, it's not expensive, local poor people can also afford it. And what that means is that there is a local regional cycle that has been set up, agricultural cycle of farmers having a market and consumers having very good healthy food to buy. They've gone well beyond that now into other sectors. So these women have set up an alternative school. They've set up a movie making studio. They've already made about 80 movies on all kinds of things, including why genetically modified organisms are bad. They run a community radio. It goes to about 150 villages, I think, and many other things. I mean, I could go on and on, but I'll stop it here. Next. Second, obviously, as important as food is water, or even more important. And for Ladakh, I guess it's a very crucial issue. So now the traditional model of water conservation or water distribution has been, you know, first of all, you think of India as low rainfall, high rainfall, which means water scarce, water surplus. That itself is ecologically a very serious way of looking at things. But okay, assuming that's the case, so then what they say is, okay, let's put a big dam in the water surplus area and transport it 300-500 kilometers into the so-called water scarce area. Okay, which creates all sorts of problems. Displacement where the dam is built, deforestation, etc. Where the canal goes, all kinds of water logging, salinization, meaning the land is also then destroyed. What's the alternative? Let's take a look at one. This is Kutch, fairly similar to Ladakh in the sense of being extremely low rainfall, very dry, mostly pastoralist, very small scale farming. So actually very similar to Ladakh. Also very similar because when the states were made in India after independence, Gujarat swallowed up Kutch just like Jammu and Kashmir swallowed up Ladakh. Now I hope that's not a politically problematic statement, but anyway, I think so. Alright, okay. But getting back to water. Now Kutch has a it's got very low rainfall, 200 millimeters to 50 millimeters. So in the last few years, some of the non-governmental organizations, along with the local communities, using both their traditional local wisdom and modern hydrological knowledge, they have made 100 villages plus water self-sufficient by just making sure that the water that's falling is properly captured, it is well managed in wells or in small-scale check dams like the ones you see out there. And every village has a water management committee which ensures that no household is overusing water. There are local regulations, for instance, you can't grow sugarcane or other crops which use enormous amounts of water, and so on. But it's actually all locally managed. And now they're saying they don't want any water from outside. They've got enough water for all their needs. It's one example. There are many dozens more such examples across the country. It doesn't mean that exactly the same solution will work elsewhere. You need other kinds of things. But essentially saying decentralized or localized kind of solutions are possible even for water. Let's take other natural resources like forests or other natural ecosystems, grasslands, etc., etc. And an example that I personally find very interesting is from central India. I forgot to mention, but I guess by now you would have realized that there is a map on each of the slides with the location of the initiative that I'm talking about. So this is in the heartland of Adivasi tribal India, where this village called Mindhalekha about 30 years back was part of an anti-dam movement. They actually managed to stop 2 big dams that were going to come up and displace 300 villages. They stopped that. But in the process, they also realized that they need to form a different form of democracy, because they can't rely on their elected leaders to take the right decision, because those leaders took the decision to make the dams, okay, which they were opposing. So they reformed their Gram Sabha, their village assembly, in which the rule that they made was that every member of the village would be part of this, and every decision in the village would be taken by that assembly. No sarpanch, no pramukh, no headman, no bureaucrat, no politician, the entire village together, and by consensus. So that's what they've been following for the last about 25 years now. In the process, they have also created a whole lot of these study circles so that they have information, both their own as also from outside. And through, next slide, Dolma, please. Through that, they have now protected about 1800 hectares of forests around their village, which was earlier under the forest department. Now, in fact, it is totally under the control of the village, legally also through using the Forest Rights Act. They now sustainably harvest the bamboo. The revenue from that harvest goes into a village fund, which the entire village knows exactly what's happening to every rupee. And that village fund is being used for 100% employment, 100% energy, water, even new forms of employment that they need, etc. And amazingly, 2 years back, they also donated all private agricultural land into the village commons. So there's actually not a single piece of private land in that village anymore, because they said that these are natural resources or common resources that should be managed collectively by the village, not by individuals. And the slogan that they have is very interesting to me, which says that, okay, we've elected the government in Mumbai and Delhi, but in our village, we are the government. And I think yesterday or day before, there was some discussion about Ladakh, the traditional governance system, the new panchayat system, the problems between them, the, what is it called, the halka panchayats, etc. And I was thinking of this example and many others like this, where people are saying that democracy is about us taking decisions. It's not about us going to elections. That's part of it. But it can't be only that. It has to be that in our day-to-day, for things that influence us, we need to be part of that decision. We can't leave it to somebody sitting in Leh or Mumbai or Delhi or whatever. Conservation efforts or local natural resource governance efforts like this are found across India. There are hundreds of, probably thousands of examples. If you see our website, Kalpavriksha website, you'll find 140 case studies of that, but there are many, many more of different kinds. Again, I don't have time to go into all of these, but these are just some examples of this, including some of what your organizations are doing here in Ladakh. Okay, now if jobs is a serious problem in the modern, in the current form of the economy, what's the alternative? And I'm going to give you 2 or 3 examples, which I think give us clues as to what the alternatives are. The first one I think is again very relevant to Ladakh. And therefore, in fact, I've used the quote from the vision document about the importance of cottage industries, right? So this is in Jharkhand, where a government corporation called Jharcraft has extended facilities to 300,000 families for upgrading, reviving and upgrading their traditional skills, hand skills, okay, silk, handlooms, art, craft, music, bamboo work, cane work, etc., about 20 different kinds of crafts. And through that, they've actually enhanced the livelihoods of these 300,000 families, which is 1.5 million people in just 10 years. And in many of the villages that I went to, families were very happy because their sons, in some cases their daughters who had migrated out for work, have actually come back because they find adequate employment and better conditions in the village itself. And this is a subject I'll come back to in a few minutes, this thing of migration, which is again serious in Ladakh. Second example is an example of a farmer, of a few thousand farmers in Andhra Pradesh who have set up a company. What they're saying is that why should we as individual farmers sell our produce at very low cost to a trader who then sells it to a retailer who charges you 10 times more than what I've actually got as a farmer. Okay? Why is it that all the money that you pay as a consumer shouldn't come straight back to me? So that's the idea behind this company, to actually control everything from production to retail as far as is possible, and to make it a democratic process in which all farmers are able to get the benefits equally or equitably. And of course, they've also switched completely to organic farming and things like that. Third example is from the hill state of Uttarakhand, where this group called Mati Sangathan has empowered women for enhancement of livelihoods and also to better their status as women. In fact, this organization started off as a response to violence against women, domestic violence against women. Husbands would get drunk and beat up women and things like that. So it was a response to that. But then they went beyond into also looking at livelihoods of women. And there are many different kinds of things they do, local produce and so on. But one of the, so that's traditional things, but also new things like ecotourism, community-based ecotourism, which brings me to the last slide on livelihoods, which is of course happening here also, where communities are being empowered or the capacities are being built to manage tourism in responsible ways. So make sure that the tourists are also responsible and that the local people are the ones who gain the benefits, not some tour operators or people from Delhi and so on and so forth. So the homestays in Ladakh are of course an example of that, some of them, but there are many others across the country, which are again showing different ways of creating livelihoods. Which then also brings me to a point. I think somebody in the morning had raised this, I think Joy had raised this issue about the relationship between the village and the city. So when we were talking about waste, whether it is the waste of Leh or the waste of Pune or the waste of Bombay or Delhi or whatever, it hardly gets dumped in the city itself, it gets dumped outside. So somebody outside is suffering from that. And from that outside, which is probably usually a village, we take their water and we take their minerals and we take their land as city dwellers, right? So it's a parasitic relationship. And so it's interesting to actually again look at the Ladakh Vision document, which says, how do we provide villages in Ladakh with adequate facilities so that migration, forced migration, is reduced or stopped? And I'm going to give you examples of that. I already told you about Jharcraft, but there are others. So let's take, these are 3 villages, 2 in Maharashtra, 1 in Tamil Nadu, where they have been able to create a local environment, local social economic environment, which is so vibrant that not only has migration outside stopped, but in fact in many cases people have come back into the village. This is a very unusual phenomenon for, not just for India, but for the globe. How did they do that? They created new forms of employment, revived old, like made their agricultural systems much better. In the case of Kutumbakkam in Tamil Nadu, they actually had lots of small scale manufacture also of things like lamps and many other solar. They now actually produce their own solar kits, etc. So one part of the solution of the relationship between village and city is this. And in the same time, because you actually create these processes, in the village, people are far more reluctant to sell off their land to city dwellers or to allow city dwellers to come and take their water resources or their minerals away. They will resist that much more than if they were poor and desperate and then they would just sell off whatever they can. But the second part of the solution, of course, is cities have to be made more sustainable and more livable and more equal and equitable for, especially for the poor. So this is an example from Kutch again. And this, a lot of this may be very relevant to Leh, where what they are saying is that how is it possible to make Bhuj, which is 200,000 people, a self-sustainable city, which means for water, for housing, for garbage management, and many other things, can it actually be self-sustaining, right? Rather than relying on taking water from outside or dumping garbage outside, etc. There are many initiatives that have been taken for Bhuj which actually are moving in that direction, which I think we could learn from. Next. Another interesting initiative, since we're talking about waste in the morning, and I think this was mentioned briefly, is in the city I live in Pune, where waste picker women, 3,000 or so waste picker women, have formed their own union and their own company. And through that, they have negotiated much better deals with the Pune administration and with households. So in fact, they have now the contract for picking up garbage from several lakh households, but they will not pick it up unless the household is segregated. So you can keep piling it outside your door, it won't be picked up unless you made sure there's proper segregation. But of course, they've gone well beyond that also in asking for much better facilities, health facilities, education facilities, and like I mentioned in the morning, even beginning to demand of companies that they change their products if those products are non-biodegradable, or if there are other problems like with sanitary napkins that they can't deal with. So it's quite an interesting movement of the urban poor asserting to themselves, and at the same time solving garbage problems. But we find that also middle classes kind of wake up at some point or the other, and so these are some examples of other things happening in cities, of reviving lakes, such as 2 or 3 lakes in Bangalore that have been revived by the local residents. Some parts set aside for wildlife, some for their own recreation and other things, and of course for the regeneration of the groundwater, because in places like Bangalore, water is a very serious problem. Or pedestrianization of streets. Why should all our streets be given over completely to cars? I mean, walking in Leh is such a problem. You know, you have to constantly be worrying about some car running over you, and we know people who have been run over in Leh, small town like Leh. So what in some places, I only know of 2 examples. Leh, I think, is still in the process of pedestrianization. That's Central Road. Gangtok has happened. I think Pemale? Gangtok is still, right? That one Central Road is still pedestrianized. Okay, no cars allowed. Now, that's just a beginning. I think we need to do more and more and more of actually retaking the streets for pedestrians, cyclists, and so on. That's the only way to stop the menace of private cars, and of course much better public transport. So there are a few things like that which are beginning to happen. The next sector, of course, which is really, really crucial is, and again we've discussed it partly yesterday and today, is education. Let me again quote from the vision document. Education in Ladakhi schools is still not locally relevant. This is from a larger quote, and then Wangchuk Le yesterday was talking about something, and I found a nice quote of what he said. Need to relink with cultural and ecological roots and learning with the community. I mean, traditionally, if you look at it, our learning used to happen with the community. It was not separately in a school. And as Wangchuk Le very rightly said, that actually then got transformed in the case of Ladakh only in the last 30-40 years, I think, into learning supposedly happening only in concrete boxes, which we call schools. And let me, by the way, those of you who might not know, the word school comes from an original Latin word, which meant leisure. Yeah. Now it's completely the opposite, right? Yeah. So I think we need to go back to... Anyway, so how do you actually create alternative forms of learning? And I think with Sekmol and others sitting here, I don't think I need to say very much more. But these are some examples of where in different parts of the country they're trying to do that, is to say, okay, we're not saying no to the modern form of education. Okay, people maybe also need to learn engineering or computers or whatever. But let's not forget our own roots, ecological roots, cultural roots. So here's examples where they try and actually merge the two and recreate some element of learning with the community. So it's not only PhD scholars who are teaching you, but also, say, a village expert, a person who is very good at farming, a person who is very good at medicine and plants, is also a teacher in your education institution. And the last sector, of course, is technology, including energy technologies, where again there are some very, very fascinating things that are happening. I think again from the vision document, if I remember correctly, Wangchuk Le was talking about how in Ladakh it's not so much about creating electricity as it is about creating heating energy. Is that right? So, solar, passive solar in Ladakh, but also one very interesting example I find is in Kutch. The organization Hunarshala has devised architecture which mostly takes from traditional architecture, but maybe some new things in it, in such a way that even in 40 degrees heat, you can actually sit inside their office without a fan. Forget about air conditioning, not even fans are needed sometimes. So you can actually recreate your systems, your physical systems, technological systems, building systems, energy systems in such a way that they're ecologically much more sustainable and they are more accessible to poor people. Okay, these are some examples of that. So when this kind of thing happens, especially when civil society, when organizations, NGOs, communities, ordinary people like us, students, when they start actually doing these sorts of things, it also puts pressure on government to change its policies and to create systems which would support these sorts of changes. So just some examples of where more progressive policies and programs and schemes have come in as a result of this kind of a process. I'm not going to go again into this in detail, but just taking one law and one program. The Right to Information Act. In India, before this act came into being, for 60 or 55 years of independence, I could not even have dreamt that I could go into the Prime Minister's office and ask to see all his files and actually have a right to see his files. Okay, today we have that right. It may still be problematic getting it, but it's at least it's a right, and a lot of citizens are actually using that right to make government far more accountable and to find out all the different scams and amazingly interesting things that happen in government. Okay, so that's one example of a progressive legislation which actually started off as a small movement in one village in Rajasthan and then became a national movement and then law. If you take programs, Pemale today told us that Sikkim actually has achieved 100% organic status. Congratulations. So if Sikkim can do that, why can't we actually ask for Ladakh? Ladakh is actually similar to Sikkim in the sense there's very little pesticide use right now. Is that right? Not much pesticide use in Ladakh, but fertilizer is there. So, but you can that can be shifted. It's exactly what Sikkim did. So there are many states that are providing support for actually shifting from chemical to organic farming. That's just one example. And I think the vision document says that maybe all hotels should become organic by 2020. It's a limited vision. The vision should have been all of Ladakh should become organic by 2020. But that's a start. And another example I'll give you, and then I'm going to finish in the next 5 minutes, is Nagaland, where Nagaland, like Jammu and Kashmir, has a special constitutional status. A central law will apply to Nagaland only if the Nagaland legislature agrees to it, and Nagaland legislature can make its own laws. So they actually have a law by which village councils have huge amounts of powers, including financial powers. But one of the powers they did not have was on what government departments use their money for. Okay? So 10 years back, the Nagaland government actually passed a new law called the Communitization Act, in which 4 sectors, education, electricity, health and roads, 30% or 40% of the budget of those departments will go straight from the government to the village council, and the village council will pay the salaries of all the people, all the government officers who are supposed to perform those services will be paid by. So for instance, teachers, if the teacher does not get to the school in the village council can cut the salary. There's been a dramatic increase in teacher presence and health clinic worker presence in villages across the state, including in very remote areas, very far from the capital, because otherwise you don't get your salary. Now, I don't think any other state has done this, but this is the kind of example one can take again and say, why should not the Gram Sabhas or the Hak Panchayats or the Goba system or whatever you choose in Ladakh actually get financial powers also over government servants who are supposed to be serving them, right, rather than lording over them. Next. So let me end by just putting this together into some kind of a framework of what many of us through different processes, including this Vikalp Sangam process, have come up with, saying, okay, any process that needs to lead us to a better India or a better world should have at least five elements or pillars. The first, and of course probably most important, because otherwise we won't be alive if we don't take care of our environment, is ecological sustainability, which means conserving nature, natural resources, sustainably using them, etc. It's fairly standard stuff, I don't need to go into this in detail. And that includes things like managing waste or reducing waste in the first place and so on. The second one is as important, which is that in India we have inherited many kinds of inequalities. We are creating new kinds of inequalities with our modern system, like what I just mentioned earlier. And so we need also then a social justice system, struggles for social justice, which are part of these alternatives, that create much more equality or equity between gender, classes, castes, age, ethnic communities, religious communities, etc. The third one is what the example I gave of the village in central India, Mindhalekha, which is that democracy is about us being part of decision making and not only electing leaders once in 5 years and then forgetting about it and hoping that they will do the right things. Okay? So it's a very different form of democracy that these initiatives are asking for. The fourth is economic democracy. You cannot have political democracy unless people also have control over their economic lives. So the examples I gave of the farmers' company or others, the Swachh, that is the waste pickers union and so on, are examples where people who are actual producers or workers or consumers are the ones who are taking decisions about how relationships, trade relationships or exchange relationships or relationships within the house or within the community or between communities should take place. It's not something that's decided by a corporation or by the government only. Okay? So it's taking back economic control in our lives, and that includes things like bringing back sharing. I'm sure in Ladakh villages there is still a lot of non-monetized exchanges. Harvesting, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but probably half the village lands up when you have to do harvesting on anybody's land or rebuilding a house. People don't ask for money, it just happens. Maybe at the most people will expect a feast, but it's not a monetary exchange. That kind of economy of sharing, of valuing sharing. I mean, yesterday we were discussing this, that it was mentioned, for instance, that in the Ladakh economy, the biggest contributor is the government service, army service, and then we forget something else, and then agriculture is only third. And the point we were making is that that's because we're only looking at it from a financial perspective, only where money is concerned. But if you take the non-money contribution of agriculture and animal husbandry and so on in Ladakh, it's probably still the biggest part of the economy. So bringing those sorts of things back in, and then of course helping to reverse rural-urban migration, like the example we gave. The last and again equally important one is diversity, and again control over knowledge. Now in the last few decades we've increasingly thought of knowledge as being something in the domain only of the formally educated, like you and me, many of us here, or of expert institutions. Indian Council of Agricultural Research will solve our agricultural problems. Or now increasingly corporations. So Monsanto will solve our agricultural problems, or Ciba Geigy will help us to solve our medicine problems. You're forgetting the fact that actually knowledge is contained in all of us, and we're all in some sense or the other experts, and that collective sharing of knowledge rather than privatization is what needs to be brought back. So all of knowledge should actually be in the commons. As an example of which is that if anybody of you wants this slideshow, please take it and use it in whichever way you want. You don't need to, there's no intellectual property right on this. I mean, okay, that's a small example. But there are many other movements of this kind of commoning of knowledge, of culture, of respecting cultural diversity, protecting cultural diversity, language. Does anybody in this room know how many languages India has? Living languages. I'm not talking about dialects. Full languages.
500.
Sorry? 500.
400. More than 400.
400. Okay, that's about half.
Sorry.
A recent People's Linguistic Survey of India showed 800 living languages. 3 to 400 that have been lost in the last few decades, completely gone, but still 800. Kutchi was considered a dialect of Gujarati. It's well established that Kutchi is actually a full-scale language, just like Ladakhi. It's not a dialect of some other language. There are 800 such languages. How do we actually encourage the continuation of this kind of diversity? Because contained in the diversity of languages is also knowledge. In Himachal Pradesh, the person who did this linguistic survey, he tells us that there are 320 different terms for snow. In English, one term, maybe 2 or 3 terms. Okay, snow, sleet, etc., etc. 320 terms. Now he's saying, if we want to tackle climate change, that knowledge embedded in that language diversity is so crucial. And the same for many other sectors. So that's the fifth crucial pillar that we can talk about. And let me then end by going back to the issue of values, which, as we know, are fast eroding. Our current dominant economic system, whether it's state dominated or capitalist dominated, tells us a very different set of values. It tells us that the most important thing in life is to become rich, become famous, become powerful, if possible all three, but if not all three, at least one of these. What these initiatives, alternative initiatives, are telling us is that no, the set of values we're talking about is this. This is an initial set. There's probably many more that can be added to it. And again, we don't have the time to go into all of these, but if some word here strikes you as interesting, maybe we can do that as part of the discussion. So I think it's actually really the fundamental thing is about bringing back ethics into our living, into our economic systems, into our political systems, etc. And through that, rejecting the kind of current systems that are actually taking us more and more and worse into a problematic area. One of the processes that we're trying to do in order to take this further is exactly what we're doing here, which is to bring people who are doing these practices or concepts or theories or visions together, not to complain and scream and shout, but to exchange constructive, positive things that are happening. We've already had 2 in the south. This is the first one in the north. There will be another one coming up in the west, and we hope to do this in different parts of the country. And the other thing that we've done is to actually set up a website which tries to provide space for stories of hope from across India. There are already 300 plus stories of hope on this website, which like I say to everybody here, is that if you ever feel depressed and angry and helpless, please visit this website, because there's lots of hope there, and that's just the beginning. There's thousands of more that can be put up there. Now, this is not to say therefore that India is going to be radically transformed overnight, tomorrow, but it's a beginning. And I think the more we learn from and document and exchange and share these ideas, also outside India there are thousands of such things happening in other countries. The more that hope grows bigger, the more that force of change gets bigger, the more the political process of change gets stronger, and we can defeat the current system. If you want to know more, there's much more on this website. And Kalmaji, last slide please, Kamal, which is my email is there in case anybody wants to talk about this more.